Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly radio show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And you don't live in Santa Fe? No problem. KSFR streams live from ksfr.org, so you can listen to the show from Las Cruces, Albuquerque, New York City, Taos. We're working on Mars, but we're not quite there yet. But in any case, you can get this anywhere in the world. And today I'm going to be speaking with Phyllis Bennis, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. She's the author of Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, as well as Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror. At the Institute for Policy Studies, she created and directs the New Internationalism Project, focusing on the Middle East, U.S. wars, and UN issues. She is also a fellow of the Transnational Institute and now serves on the National Board of the Jewish Voice for Peace. She works with many anti-war and Palestinian rights organizations, writing and speaking widely across the United States and the world. She spoke at the home of our friends Mariel Nanasi and Jeff Haas this past Monday, so I thought I'd widen her audience just a bit by having her on the show today. We'll get to Phyllis in just a moment, but first a few announcements. Last week, I interviewed Gail Evans, the lead attorney who spent 2 years developing the recently filed lawsuit designed to force the state to take adequate steps, or actually any steps, to more effectively regulate and assess penalties for the gas and oil industry's wanton spewing of methane and leaking of toxic fracking fluids. It was a most illuminating show. I want to remind you that if you're listening to this show and driving around town and miss any of it, you can always go to retakeourdemocracy.org and click on Retake on the Radio and watch the YouTube recordings of all of our interviews. They're all there at Retake on the Radio in chronological order. So you can also, while you're there, I would strongly recommend taking a look at some of the other shows, because we take a great deal of pride in curating great guests on our show. As we announced in our last blog, Retake is taking a 6-month hiatus, so Roxanne and I have time and energy to address some long overlooked personal aspirations and to restore balance in our lives. We've been rewarded with this with COVID. So that has been what our lives have been about the last 2 weeks. Couch reading. That's about it. So we haven't really done much on the transition for Retake Our Democracy, but we'll be getting back to it probably in about another week, and we'll keep you posted on the radio show. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could learn much from their custodial caring for the land, water, and air. Okay, let's get started. Welcome, Phyllis. How have you been?
Very well. Good to be with you, Paul, here in Santa Fe.
Okay. Sorry to have missed your talk on Monday, but when COVID beckons, you pay attention and you don't expose others. So we missed it. So I always like to let guests introduce themselves. So how about you take a couple of minutes to tell us who you are, why you became an author focused on the Middle East and its conflicts generally, and more specifically on Palestine.
Well, that's a big question, but the quick version is I've worked on international issues since I was in college, from Vietnam forward. And the question of Palestine is fundamental to any understanding of internationalism, of international law, of human rights, of a whole host of issues. Plus, I grew up Jewish and very pro-Israel when I was a kid. Spent a lot of time working at Zionist youth camps and Zionist youth groups. And that was my worldview. And so when I changed it and realized I think there was some contradictions here, I've just continued that work around Vietnam, around opposing apartheid in South Africa, opposing the Central American wars. And these days I work on a lot of issues, but one of the biggest ones is Israel-Palestine.
Well, it's interesting. It sounds like we've had a parallel path there, because I grew up Jewish in an almost all Jewish community, and even wound up living in Israel for 18 months, considering Aliyah. But exposure to the views of the Israelis was enough to convince me that there was no dialogue there. Or one of the things that ultimately caused us to move back was just that our experience with Israeli men was that it didn't matter whether you were talking about the weather, sports, or politics. There were no ears involved. They knew what they wanted, they knew what they were saying, and they knew they were right, and that was the end of the debate. And so we didn't do that. And then, of course, as you noted, connecting some dots about American militarism is enough to make you realize that there's a problem there. So, since we last spoke, you've broadened your scope of work to include U.S. militarism more broadly. So, later in the show, we may pivot to the Ukraine. But for now, can you update our listeners on the status of the Palestinian conflict and why U.S. activists should be paying attention?
Well, conditions on the ground for Palestinians inside the occupied West Bank, the occupied Gaza Strip, and occupied East Jerusalem have been deteriorating rapidly. There's been a huge escalation of violence from Israeli settlers and from the Israeli state, from soldiers, in the last several years, and most particularly in the last few months since the election of what is widely understood to be the most far-right neo-fascist government in Israel. This is a coalition government led by Bibi Netanyahu, as has been prime minister for many, many years now. And this latest iteration of his government is made up not as before when he led sort of the right and center right in a kind of coalition, an uneasy coalition. He now leads a coalition of the right, the far right, the extreme right, and the fascist right. And I use that word quite advisedly. It refers to two very specific parties in the coalition, one of which is called Jewish Power. It's a party that was banned in Israel for its racism towards Arabs, its racism towards Palestinians, and is led by an absolute extremist, Ben Gvir, who has advocated the most dramatic kinds of repressive policies against Palestinians. All of this takes place in the context of continued US policies that were rooted in the policy changes made by the Trump administration. I think most of your listeners will remember what happened when Trump was in office. He embraced Israel with an incredible fervor, despite displaying clear anti-Semitic positions as well. Both those things went forward. And his most extreme positions took place during his visit to Israel in 2018, where, among other things, he moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem in violation of international law, in violation of a host of UN resolutions, and against all prior US policy. He acknowledged to the Israeli government that the US now recognized their illegal annexation of the Golan Heights, the Syrian Golan Heights. He made clear that the US position is now that settlements, illegal settlements across the West Bank and occupied Jerusalem are legal and acceptable. And he also made clear that any future annexation of West Bank territory would be fine. Those were absolutely extreme positions. And candidate Joe Biden and President Joe Biden at the beginning of his administration made very clear that he completely disagrees with all of those policies. And I have no doubt that that's true. However, he has done nothing to reverse them. And given that he's been in office now for 2 years, these are now Biden's policies. So as US taxpayers, as US voters, some of us, as American citizens, some of us, we all have an obligation to challenge those policies that are being waged in our name. The Biden administration doesn't claim those policies. They don't say, this is what we believe, this is what we do, but it is what they do because they have not changed it. So we have an even stronger obligation than before to make those changes. And what we're seeing, the good news now, I think, is that we're seeing an extraordinary level of shift in the public discourse across the United States, particularly among young Democrats, young Jews, and people of color. Those three components have shown extraordinary changes in public opinion towards Israel, towards Palestinians, across the board. So a poll about 2 years ago, I guess, it was a University of Maryland poll, indicated that 25% of American Jews believe that Israel is an apartheid state. That was an extraordinary shift in public opinion. A couple of months ago, a new poll, I'm forgetting if it was Pew or University of Maryland, one or the other, asked a question about broad views towards Israel, towards the nature of the state of Israel. And about half of the participants in the poll said some version of, I don't know, or I don't have an opinion. But if you take just those who had an opinion, the highest percentage was among Democrats, 44% of whom said Israel is an apartheid state. That's amazing. That's amazing. Republicans, absolutely the opposite. Republicans are embracing Israel. And the result is support for Israel, which for so many decades in this country was a bipartisan point of consensus in Congress, is now a thoroughly partisan issue. It's a Republican issue. And the divide between, for example, the Democratic electeds in Congress and the Democratic base is huge and getting bigger. It's not shrinking. The Democratic electeds on this issue are farther and farther and farther out of touch with their own constituents. So for all those reasons, we need to be working on this issue to show our members of Congress where public opinion actually is, to familiarize them with the conditions on the ground, and the fact that the $3.8 billion a year that we give to the Israeli military, directly to the military, no restrictions, no nothing, no accountability, no human rights conditionality, no nothing.
So
Makes us
I'm
complicit.
gathering that the Republicans are not actually asking for that to be reduced as part of the debt.
No, not at all.
Ceiling.
Quite the contrary. We are hearing that the US is making noises, at least, I don't think it's official yet, that they're thinking about cutting the US grant every year to UNRWA, the UN agency that provides some support for Palestinian refugees in the region, mainly in the West Bank and Gaza and Jordan and Syria and elsewhere, cutting that by $100 million. It's a pittance of an amount of money that the US gives at all, and now they're talking about cutting it. The Republicans want to cut it altogether, which is what Trump did. He eliminated the US grant to UNRWA for his years in the White House.
So we've gone a long way since 2007, where the US was pushing to achieve a two-state solution in Palestine. What would a two-state solution look like? Is that a resolution the Palestinians would support? And why did this solution dissolve?
Well, I think there were many who believed that a two-state solution, as it was contemplated, was never a just solution. It was accepted by many Palestinians as what was possible. It was never just. It came out of a long series of land expropriations, land encroachment, land theft that had started way back before the creation of the State of Israel. But whatever one thinks about whether it was just or not, it's become impossible. It's not a viable option anymore because there's no more land to build a Palestinian state. There were other problems with it. The two states that were contemplated were never actually two states. They were one state, Israel, and another, not quite a state, because the state, quote, that the Israelis, the US, even the UN contemplated was a state that would be forcibly disarmed from outside, never allowed to have a military of its own, would have no control of its own borders, would have no control of exit or entry into the country, would have no control of its electrical grid, no control of its water or its coastal waters, would have no control at all. So it would not be a sovereign state. It would be an entity that some would call a state. But even that now is no longer possible because of the fact that there are now about 800,000 illegal Israeli settlers living in Jews-only settlements across the West Bank and East Jerusalem, who are essentially breaking international law every morning just by getting out of bed because they're living in occupied territory in illegal settlements. They now control about 60% of the West Bank directly, control all of it in practice, but officially it's about 60%. So there's simply no land for anything remotely resembling a contiguous, viable Palestinian state.
So if the two-state solution is not viable, what could a just resolution look like? And would this satisfy either side?
Well, what exists today is one state. If you define a state as a territory with one government in control of it, it's a state. The problem is that it's an apartheid state with different levels of rights and privileges depending on language, national origin, religion, race, etc., depending on what part of that state you live in. If you live inside the 1949 borders of Israel, if you live in the occupied West Bank, if you live in occupied Gaza Strip, or if you live in occupied East Jerusalem, you have a different status in each of those. But in all of them, there is a difference between the legal structures imposed on people who are Israeli Jews or who are Israeli Palestinians, if we're talking about inside the 49 borders, or who are Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza or occupied Jerusalem. So that's essentially the definition of apartheid, when you have one governing power in control of populations that are divided on the basis of race, national origin, religion, etc., and where different legal systems are imposed. So if we, in terms of what that looks like on the ground, it doesn't look like apartheid in South Africa. We have to sort of get past that. It looks very different. It's a very different version. But like South African apartheid, it is in violation of the International Covenant Against the Crime of Apartheid. What it looks like on the ground, if you imagine two 12-year-old kids in the West Bank, and they both have been mischievous for whatever reasons, either childhood mischief or some version of nationalism, for whatever reason, they've both been throwing stones. So the 12-year-old Israeli kid gets potentially arrested by the police. They can't take him or her into custody, of course, because you don't do that with children. They are never taken out of the custody of their parents. Their parents are with them at all times. They are never interrogated. They always will have a lawyer with them, an advocate for them. And the legal system for them, appropriately, is based on the idea of what is best for the child, for this 12-year-old to grow into a law-abiding adult, etc., as is our legal system here too. As we know, it doesn't always work that way, but in theory, that's our legal system as well. What happens to the, and if they go to court, it will be to juvenile court with a separate set of judges, people specially trained to deal with children, all the appropriate measures to protect children. What happens to the Palestinian kid who was throwing stones? The Palestinian kid is most likely arrested not on the spot, but at 2 o'clock in the morning, in the dark of the night, deliberately, according to the UNICEF reports, because it terrorizes the family. He or she is taken away from the family. The parents are not told where the child is taken. They are most often taken out of the occupied territories into Israeli territory, which is itself another violation of international law. They are interrogated and they are put on trial in a military court. From the age of 12, Palestinians can be tried in military courts. Israel is the only country in the world that has a military juvenile detention system. And it's that system that Congresswoman Betty McCollum's bill is designed to prevent our money from funding. Her bill doesn't call for cutting US military aid, but it says very clearly it shall not be used for the detention of children or for the demolition of family homes. So you see the disparity of what happens to two different 12-year-olds based on national origin, language, religion, etc. So that's what we're dealing with now. A just solution would be, as the result of an anti-apartheid struggle, if you will, a one state as it exists now, probably, with equality for all. That's the key. It's not the number of states. It's the question of human rights and equality. So if there's two states, let's talk about equality within both states and equality between the two states. So you don't pretend that some entity that has no control of its own borders, its own water, et cetera, is a state. It's not. If you're going to have a state, you have a state. And you make sure that everybody in that state is treated equally and that the two states are treated equally. That's not what is most likely, I think. But, you know, I'm a Jewish girl from California. It's not up to me to say how many states there should be. But it is up to me to say what my government and my tax dollars should be supporting in that region for people. For people. That's what we're dealing with.
Okay, so we need to take a break here to remind our listeners that in an era replete with misinformation in social and mainstream media and from politicians of all flavors, KSFR is more important than ever, offering timely news and alerts and a wide range of programming to keep you informed and sane in these ever so challenging times. At KSFR, you get the straight scoop, fact-based news from Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, The View from Europe with the BBC, COVID, go away, and KSFR's own local and state news programming. We also get great music and informative discussions on timely issues with Richard Wolf's Economic Update and Retake Our Democracy, offering a progressive power hour of socialist radio each Saturday morning from 8 to 9 a.m. You may not always agree with all you hear on KSFR on Saturday morning, but you will always be challenged. So for those who can afford it, please consider making a contribution. Go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button, and toss them 10, 20, or even $50. And think of it as your ticket for admission to a wealth of welcoming programming. Let's get back to the Institute of Policy Studies fellow Phyllis Bennis and our discussion of the Palestinian conflict. And so far, we haven't heard a lot of good news, and we may not. So
Oh,
Phyllis,
let me challenge you on that. We've heard good
okay,
news about the changing discourse in the United States. That's very good news and very important.
okay, stand corrected. Back in the 70s, and it sounds like this is maybe your path too, as the Vietnam War came to an end, I looked at the world and saw four major international conflicts that seemed impervious to peaceful resolution: Berlin Wall, North Ireland, South Africa, and Palestine. We have achieved some form of resolution for all but the Palestinian conflict. Do you have much hope for resolution here? If so, how could you see peace being realized, and what has to give?
Wow, that's a big question. I am hopeful, ironically enough, despite the horrific conditions facing my Palestinian friends in the occupied territories, but also inside Israel and also among the refugees who are now in their fourth and fifth generation being denied their internationally guaranteed right to return to their homes. I'm hopeful because I think what maintains Israeli power to continue its apartheid policies is not just the history of settler colonialism that goes back more than 70 years, but also the unconditional support it has counted on from the United States. That starts with the $3.8 billion a year that we give to the Israeli military, usually followed up by another billion or so. But it goes far beyond that. It includes things like protection of Israeli positions at the United Nations, making sure that almost any resolution critical of Israel in the Security Council will be vetoed, and resolutions in the General Assembly will be either watered down, weakened, or ignored, and countries threatened if they threaten to vote for it. So US power is often deployed in a variety of international arenas in defense of Israeli policy. There's an interesting note here, Paul. A friend of mine did some extraordinary research on the history of the US veto at the United Nations. And if you look at the period, I forget exactly when it is, from about the late 50s through the 70s, into the 80s, the US vetoes were used more than any other country by far. Russia used some at the very beginning of the United Nations to keep out certain countries. But since then, at that time, the US was almost the only one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council to consistently use its vetoes. And of those, about a third went to defending South African apartheid, or Southern African apartheid. It wasn't only South Africa, it was also Namibia and Rhodesia. But the rest went to defending Israeli apartheid. So it's really interesting that the US historically relied on its use of the veto in the Security Council to defend and protect white supremacy, Jewish supremacy over Palestinians, and discrimination on that level at a massive level.
And so I guess what your conclusion from that is that should American public opinion and international public opinion move the United States to a more just position, that it would force Israel to become more accommodating and, examine some alternatives that might afford Palestinians more justice.
That's exactly right. I think our job in this country, we're not going to liberate Palestine. That's a job for the Palestinian people. Our job, I think, is to change our government's policies so it stops being the main impediment to Palestinians achieving their right of self-determination, freedom, and equality. That's the key. Now, what position Israel takes in relation to that, I can't predict. The polls do not give us much hope, not least because although the move to the right has been underway in Israel for decades now, the recent shift to a much more dramatic, violent kind of far right extremism has been especially attractive to the young. And that's a very sad reality. If you look at the age cohorts of Israelis who are polled on a whole host of issues, you see that it's the youngest cohort, the 16 to 24-year-olds, who are the most extreme in anti-Arab racism, in all their opposition to Palestinian rights, across the board. They are the most extreme. And it goes down from there, so that the most unlikely to be extremists, where you see the highest concentration of progressives, et cetera, is the oldest cohort. And that's a sad reality. It's the opposite of what's true in this country, I think.
Okay. Well, I grew up in a community that was over 90% Jewish, and that community was split down right down the middle, with half strongly opposing Israeli military solutions and about the same proportion fiercely supporting Israel, often citing the Holocaust as significant justification for any and all military action and as justification for stifling Jewish advocacy for Palestinian rights. Would that be an accurate characterization of the divide among the Jewish community today? And given your work to expand advocacy for Palestine in the US and among the Jewish community, and if so, how do you address that split?
Well, I don't think the split is anything near that now. That was some of the polls that I indicated earlier.
Right.
You had a poll taken by the Jewish Electoral Institute in the United States in 2019 indicating 25% of American Jews believe that Israel is an apartheid state. That's an extraordinary number, and they are disproportionately young. On the other hand, the second part of your question, is this why we're seeing the crackdown, if you will, on opponents of Israeli militarism, et cetera? The answer is still yes, because the mainstream organizations among Jewish supporters of Israel, and we should be clear that Jewish support for Israel is not the only, and in many cases, not even the most important part of US support for Israel. The Christian fundamentalist support for Israel, Christian Zionism, organizations like CUFI, Christians United for Israel, led by the far-right preacher, Reverend Hagee. These organizations, these movements are absolutely crucial to building up US congressional support. We are seeing a crackdown, new pressures, new attacks on supporters of Palestinian rights in universities and organizations. My organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, is one of the biggest and fastest growing Jewish organizations out there. So I'm very optimistic that we are changing opinions even within the Jewish community, especially within the Jewish community.
Well, we're unfortunately running out of time, and so we'll continue this discussion on our YouTube recording. But for now, Phyllis, can you tell people, our listeners, where they can get more information about the Institute for Policy Studies and you?
Sure. Our website is ips-dc.org. And on the website, you can look at the New Internationalism Project. My colleague, Corey Peterson-Smith, and I have lots of articles and interviews and films and stuff up, and check out the work of my colleagues as well.
I'd also encourage people who feel like they could get a good grip on what's going on in Palestine to take a look at Phyllis's book on the Israeli conflict. I would hold it up in front of the camera. Oh, I will. Right here. There it is, camera. It's the Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, the primer. And it has a whole slew of questions that, and then answers to those questions that are germane to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they give you a good grounding on what's going on and how we got there. With that, we're going to have to close the show. We'll be back next week with a surprise. If I told you what it was, it wouldn't be a surprise. But in the meantime, please stay active and engaged. It's the only way we fix this mess. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.
All right, we're back with Phyllis Bennis, and we're going to talk a little bit more. You were alluding to the fierce opposition to, and it's sort of an institutional opposition to American advocacy on behalf of Palestine, and in particular, the BDS movement. In New Mexico, we've seen a governor who has signed a declaration calling boycotts and other kinds of sanctions as anti-Semitic, and I understand the president is also advancing that position.
Well, not quite. The president's position on anti-Semitism, which came out in a new paper just a couple of days ago, is actually far more nuanced than some of us had feared it might be. The key component of it had to do with the definition of anti-Semitism. And there's been a very problematic definition circulating for some years, known as the IRA definition. It stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Association,
Right.
An organization that does work on documenting the Holocaust education, et cetera. And one of their staff at the time drafted a working document. He was very clear that this should never be used as a legal definition, that it would necessarily impinge on First Amendment rights of free speech, et cetera. But he offered a working definition of anti-Semitism that was unfortunately very problematic. The definition itself was a very brief 1 or 2 line definition, which, defining anti-Semitism is not that hard. Hatred of Jews as Jews. That's kind of what anti-Semitism is. And his definition says essentially that. But what he did that made it so problematic was to attach a set of 11 examples of what that might look like. And 7 of the 11 examples were not examples of anti-Semitism at all. They were examples of criticism of Israel, which in theory could come from an anti-Semite, but are not by any stretch of the imagination anti-Semitic in themselves. So that's what there's been a huge amount of fighting about for the last several years around the world, because the IRA has been pushing to do exactly what its proponent said he should never do, which is to make this the legal definition. There's 30 states across the US that are now debating this issue to have laws mandating the IRA definition. And the significance of it isn't just this is what the government thinks is anti-Semitism. It can be the basis for legal criminal charges if someone is participating in a demonstration against Israeli aggression and somebody else says, well, that's anti-Semitism, they could be charged with a hate crime. This has very, very serious consequences, chilling effect, particularly on Palestinians living in the United States, but for everyone, for Jews like us that may criticize Israel, for everyone. So it's a devastating instrument, the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And what it does with these false claims of anti-Semitism is to undermine the real struggle against the real rise in real violent anti-Semitism that is around in this country, is on the rise, and is rooted in white supremacy. Right. So the need to build a movement against anti-Semitism that is part of the movement against white supremacy and against racism, against all of the components of racism in this country, that's where we have to ground our struggle against anti-Semitism. And by focusing it on this false claim that anti-Semitism really looks like criticism of Israel, we're undermining our own ability to do that. So it's very dangerous. The other aspect that's going on right now is that, as I mentioned earlier, the mainstream pro-Israel organizations are very, very worried about losing the youth, particularly in the Jewish community. They know that young Jews are no longer identifying with Israel as key to their Jewish identity. When I was a kid growing up in California, that's what it meant to be Jewish. It was all about Israel. We didn't talk about God very much, really at all. We talked about Israel. That's not true anymore. Young Jews have all kinds of ways of identifying as Jews, making that part of their identity as social justice activists, all those things. So in that context, the mainstream organizations are getting very worried. and they know they can't any longer win the arguments. So they've almost given up on persuasion. And instead, they're just trying to attack people they perceive as leaders or spokespeople or vulnerable to ideas they don't like by challenging them in court, by forcing people to lose their job. When Mark Lamont Hill spoke at the United Nations 2 years ago on the annual Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, the pro-Israel lobbies were very upset about one thing he said, and within a day he had lost his job at CNN. They fired him without a moment's thought. Right? They tried to get him fired from Temple University, but luckily he had tenure, so they couldn't do anything to him. But people are very vulnerable. And this kind of attack motif is what we're seeing right now. And it's very, very dangerous.
What was the one thing that he said that led to the attacks
Oh,
against him?
it was at the end of his speech, he was talking about he he was talking about the need for equality for all. And he said we need equality for all, something, from the river to the sea. And it was that phrase, from the river to the sea, that they charged on and said, that proves he's trying to destroy the state of Israel, which is like, what? It doesn't make any sense. But this is one of those issues. Saying you want one state is saying you want to destroy the state of Israel. You're taking away the rights of the state of Israel. Me, I don't believe that states have rights. I don't think Israel has the right to be an apartheid state. I don't think the US has a right to be a settler colonial state. It is one. It exists. We have to figure out how to deal with it. I'm not talking about destroying it, but I'm certainly talking about not having it be what it is today.
Sure.
So that's what we're talking about.
So I have a question that I really wish I had been able to squeeze into the radio show. Is the best way to understand US support for Israel by looking through a capitalist lens? It seems that most every US policy position has more to do with the best interests of corporate America and secure profits than anything to do with the best interests of the populaces of the countries with whom we deal. How are US positions on Israel fueled by profit and unimpeded access to the Middle East oil, which Bush famously said was our oil?
Yeah, I think that oil and corporate profits in the Middle East is part of our policy towards Israel, but it's not the main one. It wasn't the original one. There's a whole host of both political and strategic interests for the US in Israel. And at various points, one or the other will take precedence. So, for example, throughout the years of the Cold War, Israel was a key strategic ally. The so-called special relationship with Israel actually emerged after the 1967 war with the initiative of the Pentagon. The Pentagon looked at the Israeli military and what they had done in the Six-Day War and said, wow, these guys are good. We could do business with these people. Business being the operative term here. And so the economic military intersection between the US and Israel began then, as did the direct military relationships, selling arms, giving military aid, et cetera, et cetera. Before that, the US had a solid relationship with Israel, but it was not the, quote, special relationship that has existed ever since then. So through the years of the Cold War, Israel was a very reliable cat's paw, if you will, of US imperialism. It represented US interests all around the world, not only in the Middle East, but certainly there as well. So, for example, in Guatemala, where a brutal dictatorship supported by the US was slaughtering native Guatemalans in the highlands, there was a campaign in the US to stop sending arms to Guatemala. And the campaign was quite successful. And in response to it, the US did in fact cut its arms shipments, but it arranged for Israeli Galils, the Israeli-made rifle, to be sent instead of the US M16s. So it's like, okay, we'll do it that way, In other periods, the role of Israel becomes much less significant strategically, and then it becomes more important that the role of the lobbies remains much more important. The pro-Israel lobbies have existed for many, many decades before the creation of the state. But once the state existed and the special relationship was created strategically, then you have a different situation where, imagine if you're one person pushing a giant car, you can push and push and really nothing happens. But if the car is already rolling downhill, and you're behind it pushing and running to keep up, it's going to look like you're really powerful. So the lobbies look really powerful even in periods when they're not that influential because they're on the winning side, right? In the period after the Cold War, from say the period of the first Gulf War, 1990, 91, until 9/11, a decade later, Israel wasn't very important strategically. In that period, the lobbies became much more influential, and the strategic relationship kind of took the back seat. People may remember that on the morning after 9/11, somebody asked Netanyahu, what do you think about what just happened in the United States? And he instinctively, without missing a beat, said, it's good. And then he caught himself and realized, oh God, I'm not supposed to say that. And he said, well, it's not good, but now they will realize something about how we're all in this together or something like that. It was sort of, we'll be back in the driver's seat now. And he was right. He was right. From the moment of 9/11, the strategic relationship with Israel in the context of the so-called global war on terror took preeminence. And the lobbies.
Great job of segueing into the next question, Phyllis.
And that has to be the last question.
Yes. The other often stated rationale for our war on terror is 9/11. The degree to which the U.S. is willing to breach all international law to further their interests can be seen in the film The Mauritanian and in the book upon which it's based, Guantanamo Diaries. As an aside, I highly recommend both the film and the book, and the film streams for free from Netflix, so do check it out. To return to Palestine, by what twisted logic can our Palestinian policies be seen as related to preventing future terrorist attacks? Does the U.S. not understand that our repressive policies at Guantanamo, in Yemen, in Palestine, and elsewhere in the world simply create more terrorism focused on us?
Well, it's hard to say that people in power don't know that, don't understand it. They've written about it. Generals have written about how the war in Afghanistan created new recruits for Al-Qaeda. The war in Iraq meant new recruits for terrorist organizations around the world. This isn't a secret. It's just that suppressing terrorism, one, is not possible militarily, and I think they do know it, but it provides a good excuse for going to war when you have other reasons to go to war, whether that be building military bases, the expansion of US power, oil, etc. There's a lot of different reasons. But the other side of it is that this isn't about, US policy towards Israel isn't even claimed to be about ending terrorism. It certainly provides a rationale for terrorists. Unfortunately, it's used not only for political mobilization against US policies, but also for military attacks that often will target civilians because civilians are softer, more accessible targets. So it's people who pay the price for that. People who are victims of terrorism are paying the price for it. People who are the subjects of the policy itself are paying, of course, a much bigger price for it.
Well, I want to thank you, Phyllis, for spending time with me today and sharing your thoughts on the need for just U.S. policy and action in the Middle East and elsewhere. And thank you very much for not just for your time today, but for your service to our nation and the world. We need more people like you.
Thanks so much, Paul. I appreciate that.
I appreciate you. So thank you for joining us this week, listeners. We'll be back next week and we will have a surprise, as I mentioned, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. That's all for today. Have a good week. And maybe next week I'll be done with this COVID.